Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of Friday Morning at the Funhouse, alongside my good friend from Canada, Mr. Martin Popoff.
Greetings. Yes, morning, sir. How are you? Are you looking at the same nice bright sun that we are here in Toronto?
What a morning, huh? Holy cow. I think it's going to be in the mid 60s today and not a cloud in the sky, no wind. It's looking good. Looking good. Maybe this whole, I've been doing this feel good songs for spring show every morning this month. Maybe spring really is finally here, because it's been a little iffy. I get people remarking in the comments every day. It's like, I don't know about this spring you keep talking about, Pete. It's like 20 degrees and snow where I'm at. I'm like, well, hopefully people are digging out of that weather and ready for the warmer stuff. So we do want to thank everybody for watching in droves our epic show last week, which we talked about our favorite 10 bands of all time. We had a lot of fun doing it. Apparently a lot of you folks love that sort of thing. So we're kind of going to revisit that today with a twist. So Martin and I decided what we'd like to do, seeing as so many of the bands we've talked about, specifically last week, have had really, really long careers. And a lot of times what comes up in the conversations with these long-standing bands is, looking at their early catalog versus their later catalog. So Martin brought up, like, well, what if we decided to revisit this, but yet we ended everything January 1st, 1980. So we're titling this one our favorite 10 bands if the world ended on January 1st, 1980, and all that stuff afterwards never happened, right? Or hadn't happened yet. So what we're doing is we're going back in time to kind of where we were at the time, or what we know of history, right? And going back to January 1st, 1980, and re-looking at our favorite bands up to that point, and re-looking at this list. And Martin and I both have been communicating all week and saying how much the list is different. And I've been, as I was just telling Martin off air, I've been agonizing over this list all week. I even changed a few things literally a minute before we went on the air today. So this was a lot of fun, very stressful, and a real challenge. So Martin, I don't know if you want to add any commentary to that.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I brought this up, I just thought, imagine if we're nursing a bit of a hangover with the hair of the dog on January 1st, 1980. We're sitting around the kitchen table, drinking beers, coming up with lists like we used to do in 1980, at least at my end, growing up in Trail with my buddies, right? We all make lists and compare them and stuff. So it's like if you're sitting there and just saying, what are our favorite bands of all time? And it happens to be January 1st, 1980, that this is our list kind of thing. So that's what but I wanted to start off with a bit of an apology to the Sons of Freedom, this awesome Vancouver band that was kind of a post-grunge band back in the late 80s, early 90s. I had alluded to those guys like having a decline in the career because of heavy drug use and that. Apparently there was none of that going on with these guys. So I love them actually even more because of this. But I had always gotten it in my head that there were like heroin problems or something in that band. And apparently they were just your regular dudes. They, Don Harrison from the band emailed me and called me out on this and kind of explained that really what kind of knocked those guys down. And I could almost see a whole episode being done on this. We should talk about this, but bands that where management and the record label could not kind of put you in a box and figure out what to do with you, sort of thing. So yeah, apparently he says there was a lot of drug use around the Vancouver scene and the Seattle scene and all that at the time, as we know. But these guys were really serious about their career and stayed away from all that. So I feel bad about bringing that up. But I hope I can. Here's one of their albums here. I hope every time I want to listen to these guys, I don't remember, getting this wrong kind of thing. But yeah, apparently no heavy drug use in this band. So there you go.
But, yeah, that's a good thing.
Yeah. It's I literally love these guys more because of that, and now I can kind of listen to them in a new light. I don't know where these rumors come from. Maybe you hear it once and it sticks in your head or whatever. But all right, so let's move on. So yes, actually, which actually is my first choice for this situation. So yeah, as Pete alluded to, like the whole idea was you see a lot of people in the comments saying, "Oh, I can't believe you didn't bring up this band or this band or this band," and you wonder, it was one of the main hard sticking points of coming up with that top bands of all time thing. It's like, well, I don't know if I'm happy with what they did way later for various on a grayscale lengths of time or pieces of time, or if you really hated some of it or whatever. So yeah, this is our favorite bands as of January 1st, 1980. And my first choice is Yes. I love what these guys did. Obviously, this is a band who by 1980 had an amazing catalog. Their absolute classic period was more or less done by then. It was John Anderson singing on all these albums. They had the first couple albums that I wasn't completely crazy about. They're probably let me make sure here about that. Yes, they are my they are my favorite prog band of all time as of January 1st, 1980. They probably still are. Actually, but you think of the run with this being the absolute greatest prog album of all time. It always wins the polls when you take those polls. There's your awesome gatefold on the inside. But big band, a lot of gold records. You've got the Yes album, this album, Fragile. I even we did a Contrarians episode where I said Going for the One is my favorite Yes album of all time. Yeah. I love Tormato. Tormato's a funny one. Tormato's one where there's another episode where you think of bands that sold really well, but you remember them being kings of the delete bin. And I remember that album always had a cutout on it. Yeah. It's really weird. It's like they printed up way too many of them or something, but it actually did sell well. But yeah, I'm very happy with the catalog, and a band that absolutely dominated in the 70s with just boom boom boom, album after album after album, just start to finish in the 70s kind of thing. So Yes is my number 10.
Cool. More on that later. Okay. So as I mentioned before, I really debated this, and there were so many movers and shakers in my list over the week. It was just ridiculous. And I really wanted to look at this from a couple of viewpoints. It's like, first, I wanted to go back and say, all right, well, what was my thinking, as best as I can remember as a 56-year-old adult, back in 1980, as what were my favorite bands of the time? Right. And of course, let's be realistic. We have knowledge right now today that we didn't have back then. And I also wanted to take into account, well, was I listening to these bands then, or did I listen to them later on?
Good point. Yeah.
Right. So it's like, so that was a factor as well. Was I listening to them a little bit? Was I listening to a lot? Was I not in at all at the time? Did I get into them 10, 20 years later? You got to factor those things in, right? So this drove me absolutely nuts, but in a good way. I really enjoyed thinking about this. And then literally like 2 minutes before Martin and I jumped on the Zoom, I was writing down some extra notes, and I'm like, there is no way. I had my list of 10. I'm like, there is no way I can leave this other band off. So I'm going to pull a Pardo today, and I'm going to do a tie for number 10. I didn't want to do it. I had to do it. And I'll explain why. Yeah. So my late entrant into this list was Styx. And originally I was thinking, well, there's a good amount of stuff later on that factors quite heavily into my decision that I obviously can't factor in my decision, right? So I was like, all right, so I'll leave them off. And then I started looking, I started taking notes for like honorable mentions, and I was like, but man, all right, the first couple albums are okay, they're nothing spectacular, but then Serpent is Rising, Man of Miracles, Getting Stronger, for me, Equinox, Crystal Ball, Grand Illusion, Pieces of Eight, Cornerstone. I mean, I listened to these a ton when I was a kid at the time. And I'm like, there just wasn't any way I couldn't include them here based on that really strong list of albums. And yeah, all right, so we're not including Paradise Theater. We're not including Kilroy, which is probably a good thing. But I do like the last two albums a lot. I like Cyclorama a lot. So, but obviously that didn't happen because it's January 1st, 1980. So, but I thought that the albums I just mentioned before from the 70s were so strong, and I was so into them at the time, that I really had to fit them on here somewhere. So that's part of my tie. And again, they were not on my list last week. They were my honorables, but did not make the list. Another band that did not make the list, in fact, last week, didn't even really consider them. But for this exercise, I absolutely had to. For one, because I was just getting into them at the time. And I think that, quite frankly, my favorite albums from them are from this period anyway. And the albums from this period to me are tremendous. And I didn't consider them last week because so much of their later output, I just really don't give a shit about at all. And that's Scorpions.
Yeah.
To me, I mean, Lonesome Crow, Fly to the Rainbow, you know, all those albums up until Love Drive, including this, one of my favorite live albums of the 70s, are absolutely amazing. You know, we're talking about mostly, you know, starting with the Michael Schenker album, ending it with the first, you know, with Schenker and Matthias on guitar, and all those classic, undeniable Uli Roth albums in between. Had to include them here. And again, you start adding up all the other stuff. I mean, Blackout is fun, and you know, Love at First Sting has its moments. You know, most of the other albums I just don't care anything about, and that like knocked them down last week to not even be considered. But I had to consider them here today. So there's my cheat for today. 2 for 1 at number 10.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm cheating in a way too, because now that you brought up this idea of on January 1st, 1980, was I a huge fan of these records and these bands, or did I get into them later? I think my number 9, I could safely say, well, I could definitely safely say would not have been on my list literally on that day. But over time, they've become a band that goes into that situation, and that's the Rolling Stones. So yeah, so here's a band absolutely were not on my top 10 bands list of the previous episode. But when I think of the Stones, I think of they're actually one of the oddities on my list where if I ever get sick of the 70s stuff, which I've played many times, there's still quite an unexplored long period of 60s albums that I could get into as well, that are classic as well. But you know, you think of I mean, even then I love their Satanic Majesty's Request, I love Beggar's Banquet, and then everything. I mean, Exile, Some Girls is probably my favorite Rolling Stones album.
Great album.
Yeah, which in 1980 I definitely was a big fan of already. I was drinking the Kool-Aid on Some Girls and even Emotional Rescue, even though that's another one that I'm not sure if it was a king of the delete bin, but it definitely got some bad reviews, right? It was considered the weak tea version of Some Girls, right? And I love Black and Blue, and I've revisited It's Only Rock and Roll and Goat's Head Soup, and I kind of get into those more so now. And then obviously there's the big classics, you know, your whole Let It Bleed and all that sort of period in there, right? Where it feels kind of like Who's Next period in there, right?
Absolutely. You know, Sticky Fingers and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All of that, and the live album from that time as well. Get your yeah-yeahs out. But definitely there's so much in the Stones. I love the Stones also because it dawned on me, you know, we were talking the other day about how, you know, bands like Kiss and Rush have been there. I've been there with them since their first new release. Well, Rolling Stones is like, they actually started becoming a band when I was born, which is kind of cool, right? Yeah. So they've been with me my whole life, literally, rather than Kiss and Rush sort of thing, right? Yeah. But yeah, the Stones, I have a lot of fondness for the Stones. I went and saw the huge museum show in Kitchener, Ontario a little while ago. What is that called? Unzipped. Just one of those big museum shows where they just bring all the memorabilia and put on, you know, floors and floors of all this amazing stuff, right? The handwritten lyrics and everything. But yeah, I just have so much time for the Stones these days. Love everything they've done. Such a unique, weird band. You know, no one would dare try to sound like that because it's not really very good. It's a weird thing about them, right? It's like the singer can't sing and the drummer can't drum. Okay, don't you know what I mean, right? You know what I mean. Or I hope you know what I mean. I don't want to see the complaints about that, but it's really funny about the Stones. They are this. They sound like they're, you know, all their albums sound like they're running a 3-legged race at the picnic, right? And falling over. They're running the sack race or something, right?
And we love them for that, right?
Yeah, exactly. We love them to death. So the Rolling Stones is my number 9.
Yeah, the Stones for me were a conundrum because I debated about them as well. And I was thinking, well, if I'm being honest with myself, I really disliked them around the time that we're talking about here. And I really didn't get into them until like the mid 90s. Now I own like pretty much everything they've ever done. And I really appreciate them a lot. But I also, I thought about it and I was like, well, they have all those 60s albums, which I have and I like, but I've never warmed up to the 60s records as much as the 70s stuff.
Yeah.
So I kind of didn't know where to go with them. I wanted to include them, but I'm still like, I guess I'm still, when you really think about it, relatively speaking, I'm still kind of too new to them to really include them in a list like this. And they weren't even close to being on my radar in 1980. So I ultimately left them off, but I could totally see the case for putting them on, so yeah, it's a great choice.
Yeah, they kind of cheat their way in here for me by having the biggest catalog.
Oh yeah, without a doubt.
As of January 1st, 1980.
Yeah, and the biggest catalog and probably the most solid out of all of them, just because of volume, right? I guess. Yeah. All right. Well, as you mentioned, to start us off with, I'm going to go with Yes for number 9. They did not make my list last week, and a lot of people were surprised. They're like, Pete, did you miss Yes? What was going on with you? We know how much you love Yes. Well, I do love Yes. The problem is I don't love a lot of Yes post drama. I dig 90125. There's a couple of other albums here and there that I kind of like, but for the most part, I really don't care about a lot of albums from this band in more recent times. We're talking 35, 40 years. However, if the world ended in 1980, January 1st, 1980, you've got the Yes album, you've got Fragile, you've got Close to the Edge, you've got Going for the One, you got Topographic Oceans, you got Yes songs, you've got Tormato. Interesting, comments about Tormato. It's like, Tormato seems to be the one album from this time period that most fans love to hate. I've never seen so much debate about a Yes album as Tormato. Some people really love it. Some people hate it. Some people like to pick on certain songs. And yes, I remember seeing it in the cutout bins all the time back in the day. Horrible album cover, blah, 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 but still some really good material on it. But I think, the quality of some of these albums, I mean, we're talking absolute drop dead prog rock classics, especially like the Yes album, Close to the Edge, and Fragile, I think are undeniable. And then depending on, what your feeling is on it, Topographic Oceans could be one of the greatest concept albums in prog rock history, or one of the worst, right? So, but yeah, I had to include them on this list because now that we're condensing and we're not going after 1980, Yes has to be here without a doubt.
Okay, cool. All right, my number 8 was again not on my list at all of my top 10 favorite bands, and most people would, this is a unanimous sort of choice for something like this. Everybody loves Aerosmith in the 70s, and then everybody picks their drop-off point after that, right? It's like the Def Leppard thing, right? A lot of old school guys would include Def Leppard on an 80s list like this, right? Yeah. But Aerosmith didn't make my list, and I love them to death. I mean, I love Rocks and Get Your Wings and Toys in the Attic. Not a big fan of the debut, and I love Night in the Ruts. This leaves out some good Aerosmith albums from the 80s. I'm kind of with them all through the 80s at least. But yeah, this is one where if we actually were sitting at that kitchen table drinking beers, they would be one of my most played bands of the 70s for sure. I mean, I would almost venture to say I played more Aerosmith than any other band as of that time. I mean, all those records as maybe not the first one as a new release, but every other one as a new release for years, for quite a long time there. I would have to say in my heart of hearts, Rocks was my favorite band of all time, probably by that point. It's almost safe to say. Hell Bent for Leather is kind of coming up there at that point. Sabotage, Physical Graffiti, but I would say Rocks was a big contender by that time. So yeah, everybody loves that Aerosmith in the 70s catalog. I've never heard anybody say otherwise. It's great, but then they have a lot of reason to not put them on a list of favorite bands, and that's what this show is about. This is a show about what about Aerosmith? It's like, well, what about Just Push Play and music from another dimension, all that. And it's like, oh yeah, okay, well, if you add up all that stuff, you're not supposed to put them on the list of your favorite bands, maybe by one set of criteria, right?
Yeah. And another band that I thought about for this, but then I was like, I was pretty late to the Aerosmith ball game. I actually didn't start listening to and buying Aerosmith records till like the late 80s, early 90s, believe it or not. They're just one of those bands throughout the 70s and the early 80s that I just wasn't tuned into for whatever reason. Didn't dislike them, just never really went down that road. No, now looking back, all those 70s albums are killer and I love them, but I was like, if I'm being true to this, I wasn't into them at all back in the day. So I decided to kind of walk past Aerosmith for this, but I'm glad you picked them because I think they deserve to be on there, I think. All right, so another band that did not make my cut last week, just because, you know, I'm not as into the post 1980 albums as much. I like plenty of stuff from them throughout the 80s, but you know, the 70s for me is when Queen pretty much unmatched, right? I mean, that first album through Jazz, I love all of them to death. I mean, there's, you know, no question. Every one of them to me is really, really strong to great. Queen 1, Queen 2, Sheer Heart Attack. I mean, Night at the Opera, Day at the Races, you know, all of them, News of the World, and the very underrated, in my opinion, Jazz. And it's just this mix of heavy rock and pop and glam and all the cool stuff that Queen did back in the day. And I had to include them in here. I was really captivated by them back in the late 70s. I still really love the band a lot. You know, unfortunately, I think for me, like sometimes they don't, when I look at like overall, they don't usually show up on my top 10 or 20 on occasion because, you know, I don't really hold some of those latter period albums in high regard, but yeah, the 70s stuff is just absolutely classic. So yeah, on January 1st, 1980, I probably would include Queen in my top 10.
All right.
Or 11 as we're doing today, I guess.
Yeah. Yes, like I say, more on that later.
Yeah.
So here's an interesting one. My number 7 is Thin Lizzy. If you recall, in the top favorite bands of all time show, I had them number 1. So this is a case, they're now number 7. And this is a case where this band is just overwhelmed by the competition. If we are looking at that time, and it's not that Thin Lizzy, you know, some of my favorite Thin Lizzy, my favorite Thin Lizzy album is from 1981, Renegade, and Chinatown I really like a lot, and that's 1980, and I really like Thunder and Lightning a lot. But so as of that date, we end with this great album, and I really love the whole catalog. I think I like the early folky stuff, and I like when, you know, we finally get the signature twin lead sound, which is kind of growing up, really coming to fruition around Fighting, Jailbreak. Never been crazy about kind of the thin production on that, but it's got some amazing classics on it. So this is a great catalog. And I had to put them higher than Aerosmith, even though in 1980 I would have played Aerosmith more. But I'm trying to think about it. I was trying to think about it, and my note says here, this is all my notes say for Thin Lizzy: 9 albums! ! I love Black Rose more than Rocks. So I actually like this album even more than Aerosmith Rocks now, and I just love Rocks to death. So I thought, you know what, because they were fighting with Aerosmith for this spot. But yeah, so interesting situation. They dropped from number 1 to 7 simply because they're going to get overwhelmed by the competition.
Yeah, it's a good pick. Thin Lizzy just missed my list because I'm not overly nuts about those early folky albums. I like them. I don't love them. But yeah, there's like 4 albums there in that time period that just, yeah. But you know, for various reasons, they just missed my list. But it's, yeah, they have to be in consideration for sure.
Right.
All right, so the first holdover from last week's list for me, again, and I talked about this last week, even though I'm not really much of a fan of the 80s and early 90s albums, and there's not a lot of them, the 70s records for me are just drop dead classics, and that's Genesis. So the first return from my list last week, again, we're talking Trespass, Nursery Crime, Foxtrot, Selling England, the live albums, The Lamb, this album, Wind and Wuthering, and then there were 3. I mean, to me, they're all absolute prog classics, and I just love them to death. And I was listening to Genesis at the time. That Genesis was probably the first prog band I actually started listening to. There's Genesis, Kansas, and Yes were the first ones that I really dove into. But Genesis was the first. And I remember at the time being pretty captivated by their music, even though I was mostly into heavier music. There was something about them that always really grabbed me. It was kind of like a foreshadowing of things to come, I guess, in later years. But my number 7 is Genesis once again.
Yeah, they would have definitely been a bubbling under for me for sure. So, okay, so my number 6 is Rush. And if I recall correctly, they didn't make my top 10 at all, which ticked a lot of people.
Shocked them, many people.
Surprised. Yeah. So I have to put them in here for the 70s because I mean, even when that debut came out, that was the heaviest album ever to come out of Canada. At that point, heavier than any BTO stuff. We eventually got Tease and Moxie, so they got some competition, Triumph or whatever, but loved that first album and then loved Caress of Steel. And then this, I remember, hearing this on Creme FM played in full, and we just loved it. Production's amazing. They got Temples of Syrinx and Passage to Bangkok on this, Something for Nothing, just raging heavy stuff on it, and then you get into, I remember getting my first big set of, Pearl 9-piece drums, and you've got buddies and you're jamming and stuff. And Rush is the band that is your woodshedding band. Your bass player loves Geddy Lee, and he's playing you little Geddy Lee licks and all this sort of stuff. So, as you move on from this, you get a Farewell to Kings and Hemispheres, but then it ends. So, it's funny with Rush. It's almost like if we cheated a little and dipped our toe into the 80s, they'd go higher up my list, even from here. But the fact of the matter is, when we can't even stick in Permanent Waves and it ends with Hemispheres, it's not a lot of albums, but it's a ton of great albums. The pride of Canada. So there you go. Rush is now number 6 on this list.
Yeah, I'll explain more a little bit about Rush later on. I was going to bring it up now, but I'll wait till later. So I was going to say, what's interesting when you talk about, back in the day, you get the put your little bands together and whatnot, and you get a kit just like Neil's. And unfortunately, most bass players I remember back in the day who were into Rush were like, well, I can't afford that damn Rickenbacker bass, so I'll just buy a cheap Fender or something, because those Rickenbackers have never been inexpensive ever.
Okay.
That's the one bass where you go into the catalog and you're like, oh, cool, there's the Rickenbacker. Call for pricing. They never ever advertise the pricing for those things because they don't want to scare you away. Because you call up and like, yes, how much is that Rickenbacker bass? Well, that's like $2,500. It's like, oh, maybe not. So
interesting. Yeah.
All right, so here's another new entrant to my list because the world ended on January 1st, 1980. They didn't make it last week because there's lots of parts of the catalog post 1980 that I'm not really that much into. I don't dislike, but I'm not that much into. However, all of the albums up to that point for me are amazing, with the exception of the first 2, which are more like space rock albums, blues rock albums. But I was listening to this band quite a bit at the time, so I had to rank them pretty high. UFO, for me, Phenomenon, Force It, No Heavy Petting, Lights Out, Obsession, Strangers in the Night, undeniable. Every one of them, for me, drop dead classic. This is the first Michael Schenker era. This is holy grail stuff for me, and I was really into this at the time. And like I said, if I listened to no more music after 1980, I would have for sure kept UFO in my top 10 list of all time. And but looking at the whole career, they don't quite make the cut. But just looking at this point in 1980, yes, they do.
Interesting. Yeah, they aren't making my list, and I'm listening to you to talk about these guys, and it's almost like they have a lot of career parallels with Rush. The only difference is UFO actually did get those crappy blues rock albums out before they woke up, in 1974, just like Rush. So they both start in 69 and get their first real album out in 1974 kind of thing, although UFO has those other ones. But they also are in the same situation with me with this show, because had we been allowed to cheat and get into 80, 81, 82, they probably would have made my list, because I'm like,
you hold those early Chapman albums so high.
Yeah, I really like that. I love Wild Willing, and I love Mechanics and all that. So by that point, it would have propped it up just enough that it would have got on my list. But I felt like I almost had to punish them and leave them off, because damn it, I love those Paul
And
Chapman
again,
albums.
I totally understand your reasoning, and I will talk about something very similar about the other band you mentioned at the end of the show. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. My number 5 is ZZ Top, and I believe I had them second or third on the other list. So these guys were on my list and higher. And that's credit to them because I love what they did in the, I like what they did in the 80s, and I love what they did everything after the 80s, starting with Antenna Forward, love everything. And then the 80s is kind of my least favorite period, but you can't deny it's a little bit like the Thin Lizzy situation, where the first 2 albums I'm okay with. I'm not loving them to death, but they're a little rudimentary and very analog and woody. But in this case, it's more bluesy rather than Irish folky, right? But then love when things pick up with Tres Hombres, and this is, I've often called this my favorite ZZ of all time, and I really, really love the '79 album. DeGueo and Fandango, all the the big hits and stuff. So this is a band with just a great catalog, but even more so, even more than those first 2 Thin Lizzy albums, and way more than those first 2 UFO albums. I definitely quite like ZZ Top's first album and Rio Grande Mud. So, and this was a band that I could say, sitting at the kitchen table there in 1980, we listened to all the time in the 70s. Always loved ZZ Top. So yeah, they are my number 5.
Yeah, it's a good pick. I think I kind of overlooked them. Again, I don't know if they would have made my top 10, but they should have been in my honorable mentions. I just didn't even think of them. And I think also because I was always kind of confused when DeGueo actually came out. In my head, I always have that as 1980, but you're right, it was 1979. Yeah. And for me, you can't have it without that album, because that was a big one for me at the time. Yeah, that's kind of an oversight on my. That's a good call. Good call. All right, so another new entrant to my list that did not make the cut last week. And I actually like almost all of their post 1980 output. I just don't hold it in as high regard as the 70s output, which for me, again, I was listening to this band at the time pretty heavily, actually. And I think I've even liked this part of the catalog even more as time has gone on. That's Kansas. I mean, first album, Song for America, Masks, Left Overture, Point of No Return, 2 for the Show, and Monolith, which was the last album of the decade for them. Killer. American prog, probably the only real American prog that was making any money at the time. I mean, you had Starcastle and Happy the Man and a couple others, but really it was all British stuff, all British bands, with the exception of Kansas. And they brought kind of prog rock to the masses, to the arenas in a big way. And I was all over it. I'm still all over it. And so they make my top 5 here on January 1st, 1980.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another band for me where I've owned that stuff all my life. I played it all my life, and it just never sinks right into my head. I couldn't tell you how anything goes off of Mask or Song for America, right? That's one of theirs, right?
Yeah, second album.
Kansas. Left Overture and Point of No Return. I definitely know those when I play them, but I mean, it's really odd. I love that stuff to death, but I just don't know it. It just feels like something for later, that I gotta eventually assimilate and learn, get the synapses fired.
What's great about the catalog is that there's actually a lot of really heavy stuff on a lot of those albums.
Yeah,
there's some really challenging material. There's some good, like, kind of bluesy stuff. There's some pop. I mean, it's like a little bit of everything. And I mean, I get they're not for everybody. Some people don't like the violin. Some people don't like all the different, the different vocalists, and it's long songs.
Yeah. All right, my number 4, I believe, is the only one on this list that didn't make my top favorite bands of all time list. So, but in 1980, Judas Priest. So they're my number 4. Feel very strongly about this one. My 4, 3, 2, and 1 are unassailable. Judas Priest, I just always remember when we got, me and my buddies sat down and dropped Needle on Sad Wings of Destiny as this new release in 1976. So we would have been 13 on Janus Records in Canada. Looked kind of religious. We thought it might actually be a religious album and not a heavy metal album. because, you know, the religious writing and the song titles and Rob Halford with the short hair. I mean, it literally looked like we thought it might be a Christian album, right? But imagine our surprise when we played that, and it's like this baby band is better than every other band that ever was. You know, all of a sudden, these guys from nowhere, obviously they're still in poverty, and they'll be in poverty for 3 or 4 more years, you know, brushing their teeth in the snow and all those stories, right? But yeah, that starts a run for me. And I've often said this, I truly believe on an objective level, as opposed to a subjective level, Priest and Queen have this run of records that just sounds like everybody in the band are geniuses. And it starts with Sad Wings, not the first album, Rockarola, although that's a pretty good album too. I've often argued that had there never been anything past Rockarola, we would have said that that's one of the all-time, you know, rare classics, along with your Armageddons and Sir Lord Baltimore's and all that sort of thing. And it's as good as any Budgie album and all that kind of stuff, right? But we did get Sin After Sin and Stained Class, which completely overhauled metal yet again. You know, unimaginable that they were even better than Sad Wings. And then we get this one, which I've argued, you know, Contrarians episode, again, one of my maybe very close to my favorite album of all time, but definitely my favorite Priest album of all time. You know, 5 of my top 10 Priest songs of all time are off of this. So you do get up to this. And you get a cracker of a live album as well in Unleashed in the East at the same time. So yeah, this run of records sitting there at the kitchen table, I could pretty much safely say they were all of me and my buddies' favorite band of all time in 1980.
Cool. Yeah, I'm gonna revisit Priest a little later. That was a hard one for me. So dropping from number 1 last week to number 4 is Black Sabbath. And another one that I really, really stressed about here on where to put them, because, you know, in 1980, they probably were my favorite band, but they were newly my favorite band, because I was just kind of coming off of another band that was my favorite for a few years. And the reason why they don't rank higher for this exercise is because of the Heaven and Hell, Mob Rules, Born Again factor, because I can't count those albums, which is such a part of my Black Sabbath DNA. I felt like I couldn't rank them any higher. I love the first album, love Paranoid, love Master Reality, love this, Sabotage, Sabbath Buddy Sabbath. Those to me are the reason why they're still on this list, is because of those records. I like Technical Ecstasy. It's not one of my favorites. Everybody knows how much I love Never Say Die, right? So that knocked it down just a little bit for me. But I hold those first, you know, what is it, 6, 7 albums in such high regard that they absolutely have to be here. If, like you said, if we were able to include 1980 and 81 and 82 maybe, and you throw the 2 Dio albums in there, well, then they're probably back up to number 1. But not able to include those, and not able to include my beloved Born Again. They had to be in the top 5. They just don't make number 1 again. So Black Sabbath for me, number 4.
Nice. More on that later. All right, my number 3, Led Zeppelin. So Zeppelin moved way up my list to number 3 from, they were 10 or 9 or something like that, I believe, before. But again, you know, their entire catalog is in the 70s. Everything they ever did is in the 70s, except for, you know, Coda extra stuff later on. But and the 60s. Two records in 69. I think they're both 69, very beginning and very end of 69. And then you get, you know, this great run of records. Obviously, probably the most mythical or super group, or, you know, mysterious and magical band. You know, so you're mixing a little with Zeppelin. You have to mix a little objectivity with subjectivity, because you can have that whole thing. Are they overrated? They're rated so incredibly high that it's easy to call them overrated. The productions ain't that great. I don't think we have to call Jimmy Page one of the greatest guitarists of all time. There's all these various reasons, right? There's sort of tired phoned in things a little bit along the way or whatever. They're very casual and quick. There's a lot of reasons to, where you have to roll over to the subjectivity to call them the absolute gods. So it's a mix with Zeppelin. But I've been a Zeppelin fan since I was like probably 9 years old. I remember one of my favorite early heavy metal memories of being like lit on fire with heavy metal is the frenzied sound of Black Dog and Rock and Roll. Those sounded so extreme. With Zeppelin, the funny thing is the metal was never as impressive as with the other metal bands. But when you bring in all those other components of extremity, vocals, production, cymbals everywhere, very fuzzy guitars, looseness, they sounded very extreme for all those reasons. When you listen to the package, they weren't writing riffs like Black Sabbath, but they sounded crazier than Black Sabbath, put it that way, at times, right? But yeah, Physical Graffiti, Presence. I love In Through the Outdoor. We just did a Contrarians panel on that. So with Zeppelin, with the whole album or the whole catalog being in '69 and the '70s, they go way up my list to number 3.
Yeah, there's always been this like mythical quality about Led Zeppelin, right? I think that they personified that decade. And all 4 of them, well, at least 3 of them, were absolute 100% rock stars, right? And that they had such personality, and all 4 of them were so important to that band, kind of like the Who to an extent, right? You take one of them out of the equation, it's just not the same. Got to have all 4 of them there. Yeah, more about that in a little bit. My number 3 knocks down 1 notch from last week, and that's Deep Purple. Again, I struggle with this one because I love so much of the latter catalog as well. And I almost didn't even include them here for that reason. But then I looked at it, I'm like, all right, well, in January 1st, 1980, I was big into the band. If I only ever knew and had what was released up to that point, and like you mentioned last week, let's forget about the 60s albums for a minute here, because I don't mind them, but I don't really listen to them. But for me, I mean, it's like you've got all the Mark II era stuff for me is essential. Absolutely essential in rock. Machine Head, Fireball, Who Do We Think We Are, Made in Japan. I couldn't live without those. I love the Mark III albums. All right, so you got Burn, you've got Stormbringer, you've got Made in Europe. Essential. I really like Come Taste the Band a lot. Maybe back in the day I wasn't crazy about it, I just kind of ignored it. I love it now, so I'm gonna factor that in. But I think that period, those albums I all just mentioned, are just so much a part of me. They were a part of me back then. They're still a part of me now. And even though, Perfect Strangers and all the other stuff, all the Morse era stuff, I love most of that to death. I still hold this era in such high regard, and I held it in such high regard then, that they still had to be here. But I knocked them down a little bit just because I can't include all the latter period stuff. So they're going to come in number 3 today on my list.
Cool. Yeah, they're not on my list actually, because I feel, for me, I need that 80s stuff and the 90s stuff to bring and 2000s to bring it all up. So, okay. So number 2 for me is Queen. I believe were they on my list last? I'm not sure, but they're way up my list now, because again, I've never got it out of my head that Queen and Priest were just like operating on a level way beyond everybody else all through that time. That debut album, for a debut album, I don't think there can be a, people might say Van Halen 1 perhaps, but in terms of just being on just a Mensa Mad Metal level of craziness and production and variety and just blessed songs, Queen 1 into Queen 2 and Sheer Heart Attack. It's just all genius stuff, right? And then A Night at the Opera, Day at the Races. I believe our Contrarians episode, I have rated this my favorite Queen album of all time.
No, happy I am that you chose that as the one to show today, just like I did. Because
exactly, yeah. At least we're not wearing the same shirt, right?
There you go.
But and the funny thing with Queen is that I remember so on January 1st, 1980, Queen were a little bit in that category with Foreigner and Styx and Loverboy and these bands where for us we were like ticked off at them that they were selling so well against our more favorite, more heavy metal bands, right? So, you know, and I bring that up because I just remember that News of the World with We Are the Champions and We Will Rock You. I remember not liking that record very much and then loving it to death now. I mean, now again, it's in my probably top. It'd probably be my third favorite Queen album. I'd probably go Jazz, Queen 1, News of the World, maybe. You know, the production's incredible on it. But I remember that at the time, like Queen was all the rage. They were like one of the biggest bands on the planet as of 1980, January 1st, 1980. They were going to get even bigger with whenever the game came out. So basically, when is the game? It is 1980, right?
1980, yeah.
But obviously not January 1st, and it's later than that. So they would get even bigger and even more annoying, right? So at that point, it starts to go downhill. And that's why if they weren't on my list at all, they were definitely low on my list, because I definitely have to punish them for everything that came out kind of later. But yeah, that run of records there is just completely godly. In fact, it's even more godly than the run of records of my number one band, which I'll kind of mention, you know, when I get there. But the point is, Queen and Priest were just operating on a completely different plane, I think, than everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, artistically speaking, it's hard to deny those albums, right? Yeah. All right, my number 2 is Led Zeppelin. Okay. Was heavily into them at the time, and you know, it's really hard to deny that run of albums. Really is. They're all so strong. There's just something about Led Zeppelin, right? I mean, I'm amazed every time I go and I look at the album sales of all those records, and I'm like, Jesus, that's just incredible. How many records they were selling year after year after year, and not a big radio singles band. I mean, it's just the very different from that time period where you could sell 8, 9, 10, 12 million copies of an album and really no radio songs on it at all. Didn't matter. They were Led Zeppelin. And yeah, the one of the first of the original heavy bands that I got into. And I think what I've appreciated over the years, because I remember back in the day, I hated this album. I was like, what is this acoustic folky crap? Wow, you know, I only want to hear heavy Led Zeppelin. But now, you know, being a bit older, or a little bit, much older, I can appreciate all this different stuff that they did throughout the years, and all this kind of light and shade, and the heavy, the bluesy, the folky, you know, I mean, they kind of covered all the bases, and it made me appreciate them all the more. So yeah, Led Zeppelin, number 2 for me, if the world ended January 1st, 1980.
Yeah. Cool. All right.
Go.
My number 1 is Black Sabbath. So this is very interesting because it's the exact opposite situation of yours, Pete, right? Because you had them super high and they went down your list. I had them near the bottom rungs of the list, I think, or a fair bit down. And now they're my number 1. So if the world ended January 1st, 1980, we played a ton of Sabbath. And I would say my first new release might even been volume 4, actually. So I might have been 9 when I got my first Sabbath album, and everything as a new release after that. So it's almost like, for me, it's a little bit Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules, etc. As much as I love those records, to me, that has the same sort of comparison with Priest with British Steel, where they go from godly and operating on a different plane to being like mere mortals making good albums. There was definitely a more second guessing and commercialism and sort of thinking a little bit more about what the market wanted, kind of thing. But besides that, going back to the point about operating on a godly level, I still believe Queen and Priest were just way more, the IQ was higher across what they were doing than Sabbath. But Sabbath would be my third for that, because obviously they invented heavy metal, and you know, they reinvented heavy metal once again before 1970 was even out, and then they got even heavier. Master of Reality is amazing, and Volume 4 is amazing, and my favorite albums by them are Sabotage, then probably Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, then probably Master of Reality. And then, you know, I diverged from you a little bit because I would then probably go with Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die. Just some weird atmosphere about those ones over and above the first two. I'm a big, you know, not crazy about my favorite band's output at the very beginning if it's the 70s, because it starts to sound a little clanky and depressing for me, and that's why I'm slightly a little down on In Rock, slightly down a little bit on Sabbath 1 and Sabbath 2. Who was the other band like that? Zeppelin, exactly. Zeppelin 1 and 2 are way down my list of favorite Zeppelin albums. So but that run of records, I mean, we're talking about the first 8 Black Sabbath albums. There's of course the classic t-shirts out there saying trust only in the first 8 Black Sabbath albums or whatever it is. So yeah, so they go from lower rungs for me or wherever I had them on my top bands of all time, all the way to number 1.
So if we were in an alternate universe and you kind of felt the same way about Never Say Die as I did, would that change your ranking a little bit?
It would a little bit, but yeah, the funny thing is, it's, you know, 1980 is for me when it starts to decrease, right? So
yeah, and I guess too, you know, another factor too is, you know, when you got into these bands, right? So yeah. I mean, I'm 56. I think you're like a year and a half older than me. So
58, yeah.
Yeah, so you know, it's like, so you've got a little bit of time ahead of me where you were getting into probably Sabbath a little bit before I did. So I started getting into Sabbath right at the end of the Ozzy era there. So I'm getting into them heavy. I'm buying all the old albums, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, he's not even in the band anymore. You know, no internet back then. So all of a sudden Heaven and Hell comes out. You're like, yes. And it's like, Ozzy's not on this. What the hell is this? Ronnie Dio, the Rainbow Guy. What's this all about? But then I totally got into that. So yeah, it's just timing is everything, right? It's that whole you had to be here there type of thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll mention another quick thing about Heaven and Hell, which I just remember as a fond memory. We had in BC a record store and stereo chain called A&B Sound. I can't remember how many there were across Canada, but it was the mecca when you went to Vancouver, when you did those family pilgrimages. Vancouver was 8 hours away from where I grew up, right? But we would go to Spokane or Vancouver, and Vancouver, so A&B Sound was the place you would go. You know, it's like the big record chain with the new releases at a really cheap price. They were the cheapest price for everything, right? So everybody, if you went from the interior over to Vancouver, you came back with 8 or 9 albums, and most of them were bought at A&B Sound. But the cool thing about Heaven and Hell, I'll always remember this. So I would have been on one of those trips, I guess. I remember walking right in, and it had the big silver turnstile and all that stuff. And then once you got into the record side of it, it was a huge record store on one side, huge stereo store on the other side, right? So you'd go in the turnstile, and right there it had one of those big chrome carts, and it had Heaven to Hell's just stacked up like this right by the door. It was really cool. So you just grabbed that first one off of it and were blown away and flipped it over and saw that drawing of the band and Ronnie, and wow, this is cool, kind of weird. Is this going to be heavy? Looks like Jethro Tull. You know, what's going on with this thing? But yeah, I'll always, and the price probably would have been $4.99 at that point. I mean basically, you know, everything was big, huge stuff, you know, big corporate store, super low prices, all the new releases, first place you got them. Even when I ran the record store department at Rock Island Tape Center back at Home and Trail, one of the places we would actually buy our records from to stock the stores in the small town was the A&B Sound wholesale business. So most of our stock actually came from A&B Sound. So it was an amazing place.
Did your parents ever give you shit when you came home with some of these albums with the really kind of controversial album covers?
No, it was never that. It was more so buying too much, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I got the weird looks from my mother on more than one occasion. Heaven and Hell was one of them. She's like, angels smoking cigarettes, what's this all about? The worst was when I came home with Born Again. Oh my God, I never heard the end of that one. Then I went to the show and I came back with a shirt, and she was just like, you're not wearing that to school tomorrow, are you? It's like, hell yeah, I am.
Yeah.
Yeah. But really, all that kind of stuff started with my number one band, because again, if we're being true to ourselves, January 1st, 1980, my favorite band pretty much leading up to that point in time was Kiss. And I drove my parents.
Nice.
drove my parents nuts with all the Kiss posters and magazines. And I mean, I had Kiss all over my bedroom, and they just never got it. They never understood it. And I'm sure there's a lot of people watching right now who don't like Kiss at all. They're like, oh, Pete, you're killing me with this pick. But I mean, we're going back in time here, folks.
Yeah.
And Kiss was my world from like 1976 through, the end of 1979. That's 3 years plus, maybe it was even a little earlier. They were my world. And I got to be honest with myself, right? Those first 3 albums, Kiss Alive, Rock and Roll Over, Love Gun, this Alive 2, and I was really into Dynasty. I still like Dynasty a lot. But that was kind of the beginning and the end for me, right? That's because by this point in time, Dynasty's out. I'm getting into Sabbath. I'm getting into Zeppelin. Priest is right there as well. And all of a sudden, I'm listening to other stuff, and I just decided that I have other interests that are kind of moving away from, because at the time Kiss is getting very gimmicky and it's all about the merchandising, when previously it was all about the music. But man, I mean, I still love these albums to death. I can listen to this any day. Hotter Than Hell is my favorite Kiss album. I still listen to Alive all the time, and there's so many great songs, and it was just so much a part of my youth that they had to be number one. They had to be number one for me. But again, that was back then. Today I still like these albums, but I'm really spotty with the rest of the catalog. I'm like, I mean, there's albums in there, discographies I just don't like at all. And I was never as into them as much afterwards as I was back in the 70s, up until January 1st, 1980. So yeah, that's my number one.
Interesting. If we did this list, if the world ended in 1977, they would have definitely been higher on my list. And on my top bands of all time list, they probably would be looked upon more favorably than even this list, because I really appreciate what they did through the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. I'm fine with your Sonic Boom and Monster. I get a lot of value out of those. I love Revenge. I love Asylum. I love Creatures of the Night, all that stuff. The only ones I don't like are Crazy Nights and Hot in the Shade. I've always had it in for those two for some reason. And Psycho Circus is a disaster.
Yeah,
but I love
good. I'm not a big Unmasked fan. The Elder, I can kind of understand a little bit more. Creatures is great. I love Creatures, and I like Animalized too. It's pretty good. Revenge is good. I don't mind the last two either. I think they're pretty decent. There's enough holes for me that I'm kind of like, kind of knock them down a peg, because I just, I really wasn't following them.
Yeah, there's definitely the holes. And then for this list, they aren't really even, I mean, they're somewhat bubbling under, but they're a fair bit down because of just getting supplanted by better bands as you move on through time, right? And we always loved Kiss and played a lot of Kiss and bought a lot of Kiss and thought about them a lot, but I always kind of felt sorry for them, like they were stupider than everybody else, right?
But their bank account said otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right. Cool. So how about the honorable mentions and the ones that didn't make the cut, and the ones that dropped off from last week?
Okay, so I've got some honorable mentions, quite a few. Pink Floyd definitely is very close for me. So I guess these are all the 11 to 20s. UFO for me, Scorpions, Blue Oyster Cult, Genesis, Ted Nugent even. Loved all that stuff, but we're missing one of my favorite Ted Nugents, I think, with this, which would have been Scream Dream, because that's now 1980, right? And I really like that album. The Dictators would have been really high for me. I've often, cheekily said, they're one of my favorite bands of all time, but it's only 3 albums, but love them to death. Deep Purple, certainly bubbling under. AC/DC for sure. They were super high on my list before. They're not even on this list. And Captain Beefheart, for a weird one, definitely love that whole catalog. But again, he had two of his my favorite albums of his, I believe, are in the 80s. So that would be Ice Cream for Crow and Dock at the Radar Station, I think, are 80 and 82, something like that. But yeah, love that as well. Zappa, I could almost get onto this list. Love my Zappa as well. But again, with Zappa, I really love everything up until about 1984, 85, even Broadway the Hard Way. I love all that early 80s Zappa stuff, all those double albums, right, coming out. It was really cool. So yeah, Max Webster's my last one. Max Webster's one that I always argue is way high up my list. That was really, really close. But then I started looking at it and going, well, you know, we do lose one of the albums. So now we're down to only 4 albums because one of them's 1980. So,
yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, so Whitesnake didn't make my list. Obviously, you know, by January 1st, 1980, Whitesnake not really a factor at all, right? I mean, they're you know, we're talking what, one album, right? What was the first album? 78, 79. So, you know, really not a factor here.
Yeah.
Rainbow didn't make my list, right? Because we're only talking, when did Down to Earth come out? Was that 79 or 80?
Yeah, 79.
Yeah, so we're talking 4 albums, 4 great albums, but I was like, it's kind of like it's not the big picture. Dream Theater obviously was, you know, Portnoy was same age, younger than me, so obviously Dream Theater not happening. Rush didn't make my list, and this was hard for me, but you know what it was? The first album, Through Hemispheres, classic, love them, right? But because I couldn't factor in Permanent Waves, Moving Pictures, and Signals, that was a big deal breaker for me, because those are the albums that really, really got me into Rush, even though I was listening to them before they came out. And I liked them a lot. And I think, you know, again, all those albums up to Permanent Waves are undeniable classics, and that's the heavy Rush period. But I felt that, and Moving Pictures is my favorite Rush album, and Permanent Waves is up there, top 3 or 4. So I felt because I couldn't include them here, that it knocked them down just a little bit. I also didn't include Uriah Heep this time around. And this was difficult for me, because I think, you know, the first 8 with David Byron are great. But then there's a couple that are, they're okay. They're not fantastic. I like the John Lawton era albums. Those 3, I think, are pretty strong. But for me, man, I mean, Abominog, which I love so much, is, you know, early 80s. And the fact that I couldn't count the Bernie Shaw era was kind of a deal breaker for me, because I hold those albums really in really high regard. And I think it's kind of, to me, it's almost similar to the Deep Purple thing. But the reason why I included Purple and not Heap is because I just felt that the 70s overall for Purple were just a little bit stronger than the Heap catalog, which does have a couple in there that are like, you know, okay, but they're not among my favorites. So I didn't include them. Jethro Tull just missed the cut. I really feel bad about that, because, I mean, the first album, Through Stormwatch, I love them all. But again, you know, there's some early 80s albums that I really like a lot that I couldn't include there. And, you know, I'm not a big fan of Close Enough for I mean, Too Old to Rock and Roll, Too Young to Die. That's okay. But the rest of the albums I love, but they just kind of miss. They're just right underneath here. Judas Priest is another one. I mean, Sad Wings through Hellbent. I mean, undeniable classics in heavy metal history. But I just felt like for me, it wasn't really enough, because I was only just getting into them right around this time. And because I couldn't include British Steel and Screaming for Vengeance and Defenders, you know, or Painkiller, or the most recent ones, which I like a lot, they're just under. They're top 15, you know, which is fine. What else I got here? ELO almost made my list. I was heavily into them then. First album through Discovery. I mean, they're all classics. I still listen to them a lot. And again, I had to take into account, well, what was I listening to at the time? They were one of those few non-heavy bands that I just absolutely love. Gentle Giant, I didn't include because they weren't on my radar until the early 90s. And as much as I love all those 70s albums now, they weren't even a blip for me. So I couldn't count them. I almost wanted to squeeze Blue Oyster Cult in. But again, those early 80s albums, I feel without those, the list is not complete, right?
Yeah.
And my last one, again, because back in the day, I was so heavily into him, Robin Trower. I still am, huge Robin Trower fan. For the first album, you know, those first couple albums are amazing. But then, you know, in the latter part of the 70s, you know, Caravan to Midnight, In City Dreams. I've never been a huge fan for either of those. So I looked at the catalog that I am really, really into. And it's really the first album through Long Misty Days. Not a lot of albums there. So I ultimately decided to keep him off as well. So there you have it.
Cool. Excellent.
So now I can relax for the rest of the weekend. Now that I don't have to my brain's been working overtime with this. I'm like, I guess I'm happy with my list. So, but you know, ask me again in a week and I might change a few things. So
yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
So
yeah, I left off all of my XTC, Jam, Clash, Damned. I think they were all in there because obviously most of what I love about them kind of picks up in the 80s kind of thing.
Yeah. This is a good exercise. I enjoyed this. So now everybody watching, this is your assignment. So if the world ended January 1st, 1980, and obviously if you weren't even born at this time, this is kind of hard for you, I guess. But if you were around at the time, what would your favorite bands be if there was nothing past January 1st, 1980 for any of your favorite bands? What would your 10 favorites be? So put that down in the comments below. I'll be very curious to see what everybody comes up with. If we get half the amount of comments as last week's episode, we have a lot of reading to do over the next couple days, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it was very entertaining.
Yeah, I got to the point where there was so many comments. I'm like, my God, I don't have time for this. I think I made it through like a third of them, or now probably a little bit more than that. But because like every day that went by, there were another like 300 comments. And I'm like, holy cow! It's like I'm going to keep up with all this. So anyway, Martin, what's going on with the Contrarians and the podcast and the books and all that stuff over on your end?
Yeah, well, Contrarians, I think we had, what did we have go up recently? I don't even remember. The Dawkin went up. I've got to come up with a new thing for my audio podcast, History in 5 Songs, but the last one was about mods, the end of the original mods or something like that. So I basically described the original mod thing. And then books. I've got stock of pretty much if it's showing PayPal buttons, I should have stock of it. That's all martinpopoff.com.
Cool. Nice appearance on Jack Toledano's show. Or not.
Oh yeah, that was cool. Yeah,
I watched your episode and the one with Steve Keeler was on. So if anybody hasn't seen those 2 episodes here on YouTube, All or Nada, according to Jack, that's Jack Toledano's channel. You've seen Jack here on the channel quite a bit. So he interviewed both Martin and Steve Keeler in separate episodes, and they were both really fun. I found, it's funny. I was, because I just did a show with Jack last night, and he had asked if I watched it. And I said, yeah. I said it was a very, very intriguing listen for me, or watch for me, because I've spent every Friday morning with Martin for the last 2 years, and I never knew he was a peanut butter nut like me. I'm like, you learn something new about someone every day. I'm like, Martin and I have something else in common, because I love peanut butter to death. So What's your favorite brand, Martin?
Oh God, I've tried all of them, because as I told Jack, every single morning it's some variation of peanut butter or hazelnut butter or almond butter on toast. So eventually you learn every single bread there is in Toronto, every single peanut butter, and also every single cereal, because every single lunch it's cereal for lunch every single time. So it's only at dinner that I have any variety whatsoever. But in the morning, it's almost like I need my coffee to even think about cooking anything. So I have to do the easiest thing possible.
Easy thing. So. Yeah, I'm a peanut butter addict, and I have probably tried every brand of peanut butter out there known to man over the years. And I think I finally, probably like the last 3 or 4 years, I pretty much, not exclusively, but I pretty much only eat Teddy and Smuckers. And they're both, all natural. And what I love about them is it's not loaded with all this palm seed oil and all crap. It's just basically peanuts and a little bit of salt. That's it, nothing else. And they're both so good and so versatile. And I still occasionally, like I told you, I buy some of these gourmet things. I'm a sucker for when I'm on Facebook and I see these ads oh, check out our new cookie dough peanut butter, gourmet flavor. I'm like, oh, I'll try that. I'm a sucker for that too. But yeah,
it's funny, if I don't write this stuff down, it's like beer or coffee. If you don't write it down, you'll just forget which ones you like, and you'll actually screw up and buy the ones you don't like again. A few months will go by. It's well, that's a nice beer label. I'll try this one. Oh, I remember, I don't like this. So see, you got to almost start making a list of this stuff, or you're just going to screw up as you go along. So.
Well, I will say, if you haven't had Teddy or Smuckers, they are the best, because it's just peanuts. There's nothing else.
I don't think we get Teddy up here in Canada. Smuckers we do. Yeah, I see. We probably got a lot of different brands of stuff, right? Cereal for sure. It's like probably very different, but yeah. Cool.
So there you have it, everybody. Thanks for watching. Visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter, of course. We're here on YouTube. all the damn time. From Martin Popoff, I am Pete Pardo. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you next Friday. Stay tuned tomorrow for the UK Connection. Simon Bray, Stephen Reed, and myself will be revisiting some concert highlights from 1988, 89, and 90. And then we've got, speaking of Jack Toledano, coming up on Sunday, we've got album homework assignment. Jack will be going head-to-head with Chris Canzaneri from the Hudson Valley Squares and the Guitarist Corner. So that's all happening this weekend. From Martin Popoff, I am Pete Pardo. Take care, everybody. Enjoy your weekend. Bye-bye.